I was still the best all-round disc jockey that there was.
This is Radio Luxembourg, your station of the stars, broadcasting on 208 meters medium wave.
Oh, sorry, ladies and gentlemen, yes. Fabulous Beatles there. There's not all that talent gone for them, though. There's still a little bit left as it happens. Now, I'll tell you what, in the hit parade for about 46 out of 52 weeks, in the top 30, tremendous man.
In a way, Jimmy Savile was the model for all those really crappy 70s mobile discos, you know, Rog disco, right? Where they're sort of like, oh, it's Sharon's 17th birthday, and, you know, and all this stuff. And it was kind of like the pattern for that sort of like, you know, a banality on a stick, sort of like blah, 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 which I must admit, we did need punk rock to get rid of.
He was a real showman, a real professional, and he carried it entirely on his own. He was his own bandwagon, there's nobody else on it. So, pausing to reflect about him, you realised what a professional he was. At the time, you said, what is this grotesque doing on my television set? Go away.
It's kind of like having your granddad as a DJ, sort of like, oh, I have guys and gals. I mean, guys and gals is a catchphrase, you know. It's hardly, you know, kick out the jams motherfuckers, is it? It's sort of, you know.
If I said something more than twice, then a paper would pick it up. And so you get things like, if I was telling somebody something, I'd say, yeah, and as it happens.
Well, then, as it happens.
Now then. That would be a catchphrase. Or an explosion of passion.
Oh!
Ow,
ow, ow, ow, ow, ow, ow.
So I had a few, but they weren't really catchphrases, they were just habits.
Rattle, jewelry, say everything twice.
I think Jimmy Savile's catchphrases happened accidentally, but I think they served a useful purpose business-wise to identify him in dance halls, to identify him to the public. He's a man who turned a lot of his accidental nature into something profitable, because I think he's a man who was concerned with profit.
Jimmy Savile was the most self-motivated person I've ever met. You know, he made a career for himself spinning records, really. And that's an amazing thing when you think about that a guy starts by playing, you know, 1.5 minutes of music and turns into a national figure.
Within show business, he's unique. No one can account for his success. Michael Parkinson.
The eccentricity of the man was like a passport to other worlds in which he theoretically had no business being, yet he was able to carry it off quite normally by kind of protecting himself with this sort of superstructure of strangeness.
Well, they turned me into a blonde, and I thought, I stumbled on something here. And so a couple of weeks later I went pink. That had a tremendous reaction, because a fella to walk about with pink hair with a Rolls Royce outside the door, forget it. I mean, it was bizarre. And then it turned into, eventually, what's called product recognition.
He had these such strong symbols about his life. You know, flashy gold jewellery, Rolls Royces, you know, a lot of homes, but no home. I mean, who was this man? It's very difficult to know who Savile was.
He was like a Mecca bingo caller, wasn't he? Something like that. He really belonged amongst the glittering globes and tinsel and, you know, spangly dresses. You know, if he'd been a woman, he would have sewn all those sequins onto his dress himself for come dancing.
I lived the part in life that I lived on the TV and on the radio. There's nothing wrong. In fact, I coined a phrase when people would look at the gold and the diamonds, all of which is a game to me, all of which is a means to an end. I used to answer their criticism, if they did criticise it, by saying, no man, he'd be ashamed of his working clothes.
I think he studied to be an eccentric, and therefore thought it was a sort of protective shield around himself to protect him from prying eyes. But in fact, by doing that, he actually was an eccentric. So while he thought perhaps he was playing at it, he really was one.
Jimmy Savile, that I think you see on screen to a great extent, I would say you could sometimes see him switching on Jimmy Savile, the disc jockey, and switching on these various characters that were Jimmy Savile. And I don't know if anybody really knew the other one.
Here you are, all ready for you.
Mrs. Savile knows gravy makes the meal.
And don't do that.
This don't make the gravy.
I thought he was a fake until I saw him lay his hands on the sick, the lame and the spastic. Jean Rook.
One completely different, Jimmy Savile. He too received the OBE. Jimmy, of course, is the well-known disc jockey. What's not generally known is he does a very considerable amount of work to help hospitals and charities. But then, that's his serious side.
You know, one of the great phenomenon of our time, in a way, in terms of showbiz personalities, is that most of them, at some stage or another, get involved in charity work. And some do it in a little way, some do it in a medium way, and some, of which perhaps Jimmy Savile is the best known of all, do it in a really big way. And I think that, by and large, it's a good thing in the sense that he's obviously raised a very large amount of money for causes which probably otherwise would not have received the money they have, like the Stoke Mandeville Hospital.
I mean, I don't think Jimmy ever gave anything to charity. He did a job, and that job was raising money, and whether it was raising money for Jimmy Savile or whether it was raising money for a charitable cause, he was the best at it. He's the best showman this country's ever seen.
My memory is of a dichotomy, if you like, between a man who likes to portray himself as very selfish and self-indulgent and playboyish and glamorous, and somebody who is uniquely caring.
Do you know something else?
Yes.
That is a see-through knife.
Don't.
Well, do you know what you should say?
No.
You can't see through it when I'm inside it.
I worked in 3 hospitals, all of different types. The General Infirmary at Leeds, at Stoke Mandeville, and Broadmoor Hospital, where people go who have problems of the mind. In the other hospitals, one broken femur, give or take a few complications, is the same as 1,000 broken femurs. At Broadmoor, one broken mind is totally different to another broken mind.
What do you think about the gear then?
Oh, great. Great.
Yeah.
He understands, I think, probably more than most, what is going on in the minds of some of these people in Broadmoor, the Peter Sutcliffe, for instance, and others who are there. He seems to have an understanding about what it is that has happened in their lives, and I think he just almost has a childlike clarity, if you like.
Like a lot of do-gooders and charity workers, he left a lot of questions unanswered. You know, why raising money for hospitals is fine, but why isn't the hospital properly funded in the first place? These things aren't an act of God. They're part of a political policy.
Jimmy Savile was kind of like the charity work. He was like kind of like dabbing at the sores of a leper with one of them new Clearasil moisturising pads. Never looking at the symptoms. Savile was determinedly and narrowly a charitable man. Contrast, for example, with Geldof, who never allowed the argument over Live Aid to stop at the point of someone putting their hand in their pocket. For Geldof, it was a question of social and political and governmental priorities. It should be right the way down the line. Savile never says anything like that.
You like to sneer, I think, but you can't really, because his charitable involvement takes a fairly practical form. To do that on behalf of other people, I think, you'd like to sneer at it. It's a sentimental kind of a thing to do. Sentimentality is not really an adult proper emotion, and we like to look down on it. But how many of us, will walk more than, metaphorically speaking, how many of us will walk 100 yards on behalf of anybody else?
For me personally, Savile could never have been a hero. I mean, I admire the money he raised, but I think that kind of function is rather a limited function. And I think his importance won't be remembered as, this was the man that really started something. Because I don't think he did. I think it was, Jimmy Savile, charity impresario.
Jim Callaghan might be Prime Minister, but when you say Jim will fix it, the whole world knows who you mean. Bill Cotton.
Interesting thing, I think, from the class point of view with Jim Savile, that for the working class people would tend to like him very much, and upper class, real sort of royalties and lords and ladies and ministers and so on, be very fond of him, if possibly in a slightly patronising way, but middle-class people be slightly wary of him.
I think people trusted him a great deal. I think he had, because he had the common touch, because he was sort of all things to all people, really. And I think people kind of believed in him.
One of the reasons I started off being a disc jockey was I first happened to be a coal miner, and I had a bit of an accident at Waterloo Pit in Leeds, and the lads came and pulled me out and sorted me out. So we thought for this edition of Savile's Travels, we'd come back down the pit. Actually, we're at the Wakefield Mine Rescue Station, and we are simulating what happened to me in the first place, and we're going to give the lads a call for them to come down and see how they shape up to getting me out the second time round. But this time, thank goodness, it's not as serious as the first time.
If I'd stayed, for instance, as a coal miner, I'm sure that I would have got by, or if I'd stayed as a dance hall manager, I would have got by. But being a coal miner, learning sense, a dance hall manager, learning luxury, a loaded person learning ultimate freedom, and a person that tried to put something back into life, however humble was the effort, all of them taken together made it very worthwhile being born.
I think there was obviously a quite unusual person somewhere inside of him. You know, he wasn't like most showbiz people in the sense that he had a real experience of working life. You know, he had actually been down the pits for, several years. He'd been in an accident. He'd been told that he'd never walk again. And very few showbiz people ever had that kind of experience. It had a lot to do with why he kept going back and working at the hospitals. You know, he had a compulsion to go down there. You know, if he was bored and he couldn't sleep, whereas other people would go down to the boozer or they'd go down the disco, he'd go down to the infirmary and help out till 4 in the morning.
If you look back over Jimmy Savile's career and you look over the things that he's done, somebody who's been a hospital porter, somebody who has worked hard trying to break down the barriers that there are over spinal injuries, and somebody who's worked hard trying to sort out the problems that are associated with Broadmoor, seems a far cry away from somebody who can stand up with tartan-style haircut on top of the pops.
I lived a life like a windscreen wiper. One minute it was dealing with unfortunate people who needed a pull up the path of life, from people like me that had been given the strength to do so. And the next minute it was staterooms on cruise liners and beaches with topless ladies and stuff like that. So my life went boing, 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 boing. People to me on earth were like jewels. It could have been a king, a queen, a prince, it could have been a dustman, it could have been a hospital porter, but they were all jewels.
Hilda was a kind of hero figure for a lot of people. It's sort of the person who might wish to run a nail along the side of a passing Rolls Royce could be the same person who would see Jimmy Savile go past in his Rolls and say, "Ah, good old Jim." So he had that sort of, he's one of us, feel which he could transmit to his fans.
Dear Jim, can you fix it for me to be in the group Musical Youth?
When I think of the sheer volume of mail of people writing to him with their problems, so many people in this country related to Jimmy Savile, because at the end of the day, like him or not, you had to respect his ability to speak his mind.
He somehow encapsulated all our sort of sentimentality about kiddies, our idea that in the north of England you have these people with good hearts, kindly people who are only really interested in doing good turns to kiddies. He was more a sort of image than a real human being, and he was just really what England worshipped as its idea of good-hearted northern folk.
You were meant to think that there was love and respect and somebody who cared about children. I don't think with Jimmy Savile anything ever came across apart from his own ego.
He was an in-your-face performer. He was somebody who was out to get you whether you wanted to be got or not. And he really didn't care who was in his way. You know, the children were props, the records were props, the performers were props. What was really important was J. Savile Esquire, OBE.
He didn't think much of children. I don't think he likes them a great deal. Dr. Anthony Clare.
I thought, you know, that his role had been in our secular society rather like that of a holy man, like a starets, like Rasputin, if you like. Working miracles, but in a secular age, not through God, but through television, he worked these miracles. And similarly, as with Rasputin, one heard wild rumors of sort of sexual orgies and all the rest of it, which he rather sort of encouraged. And the fact that he encouraged, there obviously wasn't a word of truth in them, but they clung to him because he was a holy man.
Jimmy Savile was an outsider. He didn't do any of the things that men in England were supposed to do. He never married. There never appeared to be any kind of romantic involvement in his life whatsoever.
Has anybody seen Jimmy Savile anywhere?
Just got round, but I never actually got round to getting married. There's nothing wrong with it at all. It wasn't my lifestyle. And what happens then, of course, it makes you, yet again, slightly different to the majority. And if you are well known, it's then fair game for newspapers and things to dab you with what they feel like dabbing you with.
Well, like a lot of aging men in the public eye who are not obviously gay, there were lots of rumours about Jimmy's sex life, which I'm not going to talk about now because probably his estate would sue me.
The really curious thing about his sex life was that he appeared to have none, and that the only woman in his life ever was the Duchess, his mother. And there was always this rumour in Fleet Street that he was into little girls. But actually, I always thought that if somebody had some facts about that, the news of the world would have loved to have published it, you know, so that the fact that the rumour existed but nobody ever substantiated it sort of increasing.
I was never hurt by any of the things that the paper said about me because the worse it was, the more money it represented. So how can you be hurt over 50 grand? Oh, and for 100 grand it would really, really upset me. You know what I mean? Oh. Hey, hey.
He once said to me, because being in this business where you say, but Jimmy, all publicity is good publicity, he turned around to me very quickly and said, not if you're accused of child molesting.
Children were very drawn to him. I remember my own daughter at the age of 5 first discovering the Jim will Fix It programme and being absolutely gripped and transfixed by this, and not just by what the children were doing, but by the presenter of the programme. And she thought for a while that the name of the presenter of the programme was actually Jim will Fix It rather than Jimmy Savile, and I remember her looking at me one day very earnestly and saying, Daddy, is Jim will Fix It real?
Now then, this here is a letter from little Timmy, age 5. Now, dear Jim, I am in hospital, you see, and I wondered, could you do me a big favour? Please, 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 don't come and visit me, you sad man.
We like to believe that there was a darker side, and we like to believe that this was a necessary counterbalance to all his good work for charity that he endlessly told us about and endlessly showed us doing. We like to believe that he went with girls, men, boys, goldfish, dogs, and yet I think overall you have to view him, I think, as genuine in his superficiality.
A regular contact with death is what gives Savile's life a proper dimension. Joan Bakewell.
In my early days, on the other side of the street, the entire side of the street was taken up by an old folks' home, run by those marvellous, marvellous nuns, the Little Sisters of the Poor. And they didn't like their old people to go away to be buried alone. But they didn't have any relatives. So what they used to do, they used to come and knock on my door, and at the age of 8, 9, 10 sometimes, I was the only mourner at a funeral to some nice old soul that I didn't know. Winston Churchill. When he died, he lay in state in Westminster Abbey. And I made a disguised pilgrimage because I didn't want him to go without at least paying my respects. When I got there, the queue went from Westminster Abbey right the way down across the bridge that we now run, the London Marathon finish, Westminster Bridge, right down the far side and right down the embankment. And it was going to be hours. And I said, well, at least I made the effort. When the Duchess died, my theory was that in life she belonged to everybody, but in death, there she was, and she belonged to me. So therefore, that suited me, and I did say, when questioned by newspapers, that for 5 days we had a more complete rapport than we did when she was alive. But that, obviously, was taken out of context from time to time and made it sound rather macabre, which it wasn't macabre at all. It was perfectly common sense. And in death, we had a great union, as in life we had a great union. I don't know what they're going to put on my tombstone. It doesn't really bother me what they put on. I have no axe to grind. It could be he made a difference, or he tried, or how's about that then?
On Thursday night, the Obituary show profiles the rags to riches tale of British comedian Norman